My name is Mubarak, and this is En Masse.
That narrative of sort of, like the self-made businesswoman who lives a life relatively free of violence, that narrative is used to sanitize the entire industry.
So, welcome to En Masse. I know it's been a while. I think I'm past the point of trying to promise that episodes will be coming out at a certain frequency. I think realistically for me, I'm just in a situation where I'm always going to be doing this podcast, but it's certainly the case that real life mass work and things like that are a priority, not to mention even just real life in terms of the real struggles that come with living under capitalism. So I think realistically, what I'm going to do is whenever I can, I'll put out an episode, which has kind of been what has been happening. Assuming I'm able to do this full time because X amount of money is coming in for whatever reason, maybe because of this podcast itself or because of other avenues of work, then I will decide to potentially do this full time. Then I can increase the frequency in which episodes are produced. As it stands right now, it's not possible. I think I'm just going to work from the material reality of my life in that sense. And I think I've been trying to just do more and constantly do more, and it hasn't been working. So I think it's best to work from the basis of reality that in which I deal with and go from there, which consists of a lot of mass work, including work itself, which is tied to mass work in many ways too. So because of that, it is complicated and there's a lot of things going on. Either way, a lot of things have been happening, obviously. I do have a few episodes about different topics that some of which I've recorded that I've yet to edit. This one was kind of really important to me because this person's work really stood out to me in recent years. And I think Esperanza, who I'll be interviewing, does a great job of explaining this particular subject matter in terms of sex work and what is sex work, what is prostitution, how does the left interpret those phenomenon, and how should we interpret it based on the material realities of that phenomenon. And I think that that's really important. So with that said, I'm really excited to show you this interview that I had with Esperanza about sex work and what it means under capitalism. How do we understand it? What do we do about it? What does it mean in regards to the question of socialism and moving society past capitalism? What role does it play or not play? I think these are all the questions that stick with a lot of us. And there are many articles I find that touch on these things, and some of which are great, some of which not so great. But I think overall, her writings are one of the best writings I've seen on this topic, and that's why I decided to interview her. This interview had me thinking about a lot of things. I definitely learned a lot from it that I didn't know previously. Also, just as a content warning, the topic of rape does arise. So for anybody who might be sensitive to that or is affected by that, that's just a heads up. It's not described in any detail whatsoever, but it is mentioned multiple times. So that's just important to know.
Yeah, so thanks for having me on. My name is Esperanza, and I am a transgender woman and a student of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism here in California. I'm a member of the organization Affirm. We are a transnational anti-imperialist feminist organization. And I'm also a survivor of the commercial sex trade, which I know we're going to be discussing today.
So in your piece, A Socialist, Feminist, and Transgender Analysis of Sex Work, you begin by describing yourself as a socialist, communist, feminist, transgender Latina woman, and a survivor of the sex trade. How do you think your particular experiences shaped your overall political outlook and adoption of proletarian feminism?
Yeah, so truthfully, I initially did not want to uncover so many details about both myself and my life. I wanted my analysis to stand on its own 2 feet without me needing to necessarily use my experience and identities to validate it. But I recognize that, at least in the sort of United States left in our culture, there is somewhat of a need to prove your credibility via your identities and often even your trauma. So, in a way, my storytelling about myself and my experiences and my identities was sometimes a little more strategic than it was an essential component of the argument that I was making. Now, that being said, I think that my experience as someone who went through the sex trade, especially, as a transgender woman, the child of an immigrant parent, etc., definitely gave me sort of the material that I needed to be able to understand where a lot of the holes are in what I would call the dominant liberal narrative about the sex trade. So, for example, one of the arguments that's often been presented against me is that any critique of prostitution being non consensual makes it impossible for us to talk about actual instances of rape in prostitution. But I was able to sort of draw from my own experience to understand that I can both acknowledge that there were moments where I experienced pretty violent and forceful encounters of rape, but at the same time, understand that none of the interactions that I had in prostitution were fully consensual. And so I think that, initially it was my experience which helped me realize that the narrative I'm hearing about the sex trade isn't necessarily what's going on and what's being experienced on the ground.
So, within that same piece, you stated that your experience in prostitution kind of started out as empowering in your mind, but quickly became a trap you couldn't escape. Is this a common experience among women that are exploited in the sex industry? And what are the socio-political reasons or trends as to why such an idea is or isn't prevalent?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And I'm glad you asked me that, because I think that this is really sort of characteristic of my generation's experience with the sex trade, because we live in an era where we're told that the sex trade is really liberating for women, and especially for trans women. This isn't a symptom of our oppression. This is how we resist poverty. This is how we pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, right? But that narrative quickly clashed with my actual experience, which was completely the opposite of what you hear when you read, for example, that Business Insider article about how liberating and empowering sex work is for women. I think that this is really an example of liberal idealism clashing with actual material reality. So, liberalism focuses on what the sex trade could be in some imaginary world rather than what it currently is and what it has been since its inception. So prior to my entrance in the sex trade, I was, mostly exposed to so-called progressive narratives about supporting sex workers, and that's what I wanted to do. But what I quickly realized is that those so-called pro-sex worker narratives were always, in the last instance, about protecting the sex industry and not the person exploited by that industry. And so, I think that I would argue that the dominant narrative, which claims that sex work is work, is really an attempt to erase the experience of the actual army of labor that makes up the sex trade, and to replace that reality with some sort of, petty bourgeois narrative of the self-made businesswoman that's able to pull herself up by the bootstraps in the sex trade. And I think that this is really a result of two things. The first is the conceding of struggle on the side of the left, accompanied by a sense of hopelessness and defeatism. Capitalism commodifies everything. Who are we to stop it from commodifying our bodies and sexualities, right? And then on the other hand, I think it's an intentional strategy of those who profit from the sex industry, such as imperialists, traffickers, and pimps, to intervene in what was the radical feminist movement really making gains against the sex industry in order to conflate the interests of the industry with the interests of the worker. And I think it's largely been so successful for reasons that have been echoed in, Mark Fisher's capitalist realism, JMP's Methods Devour Themselves, where he says our imagination is becoming thoroughly capitalist. I think that it's becoming increasingly difficult to envision a world where everything, including our bodies and sexualities, are not actually commodified. And I think that for those of us who actually experience the sex trade, it sort of results in this cognitive dissonance where we're told it's one thing and then we experience the complete opposite of what we're told.
I guess on the opposite side of that, how would you respond to people that say they enjoy being in that industry?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. The first is that because we live within the centers of capitalism, the experiences that we hear about are going to be very, very different than the experiences of women in the third world. The second thing is that the loudest voices in sex trade activism tend to be not from women who are involved in street prostitution, but from somewhat better off women who are involved in different forms of the sex industry that tend to speak for all of the women in the sex industry. So let me give you an example. In one article, this white dominatrix who works in a dungeon where no fluid is exchanged is talking to reporters about why we should decriminalize pimps, buyers, and traffickers. Yet her experience as a dominatrix in a legal dungeon is so completely different from the experience of, say, Black and brown women in working class neighborhoods in Oakland, California, who have to walk the track every night. And so I guess the last thing I would say to that is anyone who organizes workers knows that no matter how much people go through, there is almost a natural tendency to assert your dignity. And in many ways, we assert our dignity by minimizing the struggles that we go through because we're able to overcome them. So, when I was organizing fast food workers within Mexican culture, we have a lot of pride in our culture. And a lot of times it was hard to get workers to open up and talk about what they struggled with on a daily basis. And I think that we're also seeing that in the sex trade. I would have girls that I would work with, and in public, they would talk about how great it is to be working in the sex trade. But in private, we would cry with each other, talk about how depressing and isolating and lonely it was. So I don't think people are really being told the whole picture.
I guess in many ways, then it kind of reflects there being class divides even among people within that industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you see is really that narrative of sort of, like the self-made businesswoman who lives a life relatively free of violence, and the only problem she really has is dealing with police hassling her sometime. That narrative is used to sanitize the entire industry, when in reality that only represents a small minority of the army of labor that makes up the sex industry. And I think that's a problem, right? Because then if we don't have a correct analysis and a correct understanding of what's actually going on, then we're not going to be able to correctly respond to it.
I guess in that sense, then what would you say is the experience of the majority of women in that industry, and what particularly of trans women in that industry as well?
Yeah, so contrary to the popular narrative that we just discussed, the majority of the army of labor making up the global sex trade are there due to economic and social coercion. They're there because of poverty and often leave the sex trade still in poverty. While in the sex trade, they often experience intense male violence. We know from research that most of that violence is at the hands of Johns, pimps, and traffickers. Secondly, that violence is at the hands of intimate partners and then also by police. Every study that's been done sort of concludes that the majority of people in prostitution meet the criteria for post traumatic stress disorder. The majority of us have experienced rape and have been physically assaulted or robbed. And like I mentioned earlier, we know that this has mostly happened at the hands of sex buyers. And also that there is a class character to this violence, in that the lower you are on the class rung, the more intense that violence is going to be, and the more frequently you're going to experience it. And I think specifically with trans women, there's also this sort of cultural and psychological aspect in that we depend on prostitution both for our material needs, such as medical care, transition related procedures, but also for psychological validation of our womanhood. And this is what I think is so malicious about the recruitment strategy of the sex industry, is that it recruits out of the most destitute of people economically, and those of us who are sort of thrown out from participation in society, and tells us that it can offer us sort of a way out of poverty, but also validation by really preying on our insecurities.
Yeah, and off the top of my head, I can think of how trans women tend to be very fetishized as well in society as a whole.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, and I think that institutionalizing the sex trade in a very real way institutionalizes the fetishization of trans women. Because, part of the reason that trans women are in such demand in the sex trade is because men are able to use their money not only to coerce sex from us, but also to coerce silence. So if you're ashamed of wanting to sleep with a transgender woman, then you can simply pay her and use her as, a sort of fetish object, and make sure that nobody will ever find out about it. And instead of forcing men to have normal, healthy relations with us, we're basically just saying, you can continue fetishizing us. You can continue using your money to coerce sex and also coerce silence. And you could feel progressive about what you're doing.
When I think of your work, one of my favorite aspects of it is that you use dialectical and historical materialism to really understand the phenomenon of the sex trade as it has been tied historically to the formation of class society, slavery, and patriarchy. Why is such a communist or Maoist analysis necessary to understand the sex trade under capitalism? In addition, what is particular about the proletarian feminism in which you espouse in relation to other feminisms?
I think it is incredibly important in our era to use dialectical and historical materialism to understand the sex trade, mostly because there is so much misinformation going around. Most of the narratives are so informed by idealism that they're very disconnected from material reality. And we need to be able to understand how prostitution originated and how it developed throughout history, throughout the different modes of production, so that we can then make a scientific analysis on what the sex trade is and how we deal with it. So, following the method of angles, it's important that we situate both prostitution and women's subordination within a historical period in order to understand its development throughout history. And this leads us to look at the first states, such as Mesopotamia and Egypt. So we know from archaeological and anthropological research that the transition from kin based societies to class based society was particularly relevant to women and specifically to the creation of patriarchy. Like all of history, that transition occurred through struggle, this time between the kinship groups and the rising elites, with the latter group eventually winning out. With this transition in the mode of production, the first states were established, slavery was institutionalized, commodities were produced with an increasing specialization of labor, and women were subjugated under a model of the patriarchal family. During that time, writing and institutions of learning emerged. Women became excluded from participation in those, as well as excluded from certain occupations. And it's in this context that the subjugation of women in Western society was both cemented and codified in law. And when women started to become perceived as dependents of men. So, Gerda Lerner, who is a very important historian, built off of the theory or the thesis of Engels using sort of new research and new evidence that was available to build off of his thesis, and argued that the oppression of women actually preceded slavery and made the institutionalization of slavery possible. And in that context, it was women's sexual and reproductive capacities that became potential commodities, which really sort of solidified women's role as one subjugated to that of men. So, in ancient Mesopotamia, society formed around these sort of temple towns. And in those temple towns, a temple bureaucracy developed. Alongside of them, a military elite developed, and the strongest of whom made themselves kings and ruled over the temple and temple property. The developing militarism and the need for a large labor force led to the institutionalization of slavery as a mode of production. And in order to understand the origin of prostitution, it's important to note that historical evidence suggests that the majority of those first enslaved were actually women and children. And as one historian notes, free sexual access to slaves marks them off from all other persons, as much as their juridical classification as property. So not only did her master have access to use her sexual and reproductive capacities at will, but he also used her for her exchange value, namely renting her out to be used at a fixed price, with the master taking her pay. So when we look at claims about sex work being the oldest profession, we have to remember that the brothels and harems of the ancient world were actually staffed by enslaved women and girls. And this is where we know that prostitution originated from. And so far from being the world's oldest profession, it's actually inextricably linked to the world's oldest oppression. And so the sexual regulation of women by the propertied ruling class became firmly entrenched in society. And the effect that this had is that it made the virginity of young girls, the daughters of this propertied class, it made their virginity a financial asset. And in doing so, made commercial prostitution a so called necessary provision for men. And so this is when you read Engels and he talks about monogamy and prostitution sort of being two sides of the same coin. And so it's this sexual regulation and appropriation of women which Gerda Lerner argues underlies the formation of classes and is actually one of the foundations which allowed the state to develop. And so we know that after slave societies, prostitution passed into feudalism. And Sylvia Federici, in her book Caliban and the Witch, was able to uncover that in the late 15th century, the feudal counter revolution actually made efforts to turn the class antagonism into a sexual antagonism against proletarian women. And they did this by attempting to co opt male workers by giving them access to women's bodies for free, and also enacting certain legal changes, such as decriminalizing rape against women of the lower classes. Feudal rulers saw brothels as a solution to social upheaval, as well as to heresy and even homosexuality, among other things. And so they intentionally institutionalized prostitution by opening local brothels, which then were proliferated throughout Europe. And they did this in order to quell the rebelliousness of proletarian youth. Brothels were used to allow proletarian men to access a privilege that was once reserved only to those of older or more status men of the higher classes. And interestingly, this institutionalization of prostitution was even supported by the Catholic Church as a remedy to homosexuality and heresy. And so that leads us to our current mode of production, capitalism, where prostitution has been proliferated across the entire world. Colonialism, destroying native communities and lands, brought prostitution and forced it upon indigenous women. And as you know, in capitalism, we live under wage slavery. We have no commodity to sell but our labor power. And those of us who cannot sell our labor power or who cannot subsist off of selling our labor power alone must then resort to selling our bodies and our sexualities. For women, that takes the form of either selling your sexual capacity in prostitution or selling your reproductive capacity in surrogacy. And I think it's important to note that even within capitalism, the institution of prostitution changed drastically through its phase of imperialism and specifically neocolonialism. And what do I mean by this? So, whereas in feudal times, such as in India, prostitution was somewhat restricted, as in the Devadasi system, the development of capitalist market forces transformed prostitution into a global trade, which grew around port cities, colonies of migrant workers, and military barracks. And through colonialism, indigenous populations were displaced, and many indigenous and colonized women were forced into prostitution in order to service colonial soldiers or whoever at the time. And so, as some of our comrades in India pointed out in an analysis they created around this, during the neo-colonial stage of imperialism, the sex trade went from typically a local practice to a global market in a neoliberalized world. And the most visible effect of that is the sex tourism industry, which is now firmly entrenched in many places around the world.
How would you respond to people who tend to say things like, well, minors are exploited too? Aren't their bodies exploited? Aren't they selling their bodies in a sense as well? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so I mean, one is that I think this sort of whataboutism is pretty toxic. I mean, it's almost like the progressive version of an all lives matter argument, right? It's like you're trying to talk about a specific form of oppression and exploitation. And instead of talking about that form of oppression and exploitation, you're asking about other forms of oppression and exploitation as if it negates the one you're originally talking about. We know that minors literally work under wage slavery. They have to sell their labor power or starve. And that's not okay. But the difference is that while all work is coercive, when you talk about coercive sex, we have a name for that, and that name is rape. And so I think that we need to avoid this sort of whataboutism because it can be used to derail any sort of argument. I see this sort of argument a lot, for example, when we're talking about Israel. So we know that Israel is committing mass atrocities, genocide, etc., against Palestinian people. Yet it's often an anarchist tendency to, when confronted with the reality of what Israel is doing, to say, well, what about other states? All states are bad, instead of being able to stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people who are quite literally fighting for their lives.
So, in your writings, you frequently tie the sexual exploitation of women, and particularly racialized or nationally oppressed women, to imperialism and colonialism. How does colonialism and imperialism and race factor into this exploitation?
Yeah, so I don't think you can talk about the sex industry or prostitution without talking about colonialism and about imperialism. When you talk to women from areas in the third world, they understand the sex industry to be something that was brought to them by colonialism and perpetuated by imperialism. We know in the case of like comfort women or military brothels that this is what really happens, and it stands in stark contrast to the narrative that we hear here in the centers of capitalism within the first world. So wherever colonial and imperialist armies have invaded, the soldiers have commodified and consumed the women. This is documented really everywhere. West Africa, Algeria, Vietnam, Japan, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Burma, New Guinea, French Indochina. And in all of these locations, women were coerced into prostitution, if not outright unpaid or held captive by gun. We know that American soldiers would rape Vietnamese women as standard operating procedure, in the words of one veteran. And the last soldier to violate her would simply shoot her in the head, right? And so it's not a coincidence or a separate phenomena that imperialist soldiers would forcefully procure women's bodies either by gun or by the dollar, understanding their desperate financial situation, which was created by their imperialist army and intervention into that territory. And for that reason, I think that when we look at the impact of imperialism and colonization on women, it's necessary to talk about rape and prostitution together. In the context of militarism, you see soldiers see rape and prostitution as two ways of procuring the same commodity. They conquer land and women's bodies either through money or through armed force. Imperialist nations obtain land through money or war. Male soldiers obtain women through money or rape. That's why I think the radical feminist Andrea Dworkin was correct in proclaiming that rape and war are not so different. And now you might be asking, well, why am I bringing up these instances of military prostitution, and how does that have to do with imperialism beyond obvious reasons? Well, as it turns out, those military brothels actually set the stage for the sex tourism industry that now spans across the world. So when the US sponsored militarization in Thailand and the Philippines, they created a prostitution infrastructure where indigenous women were prostituted to serve imperialist armies. That now laid the groundwork for the sex tourism industry today, which now is a multi-billion-dollar industry rich off of the selling of women and children. And this is even supported by nation states themselves. So we see states using prostitution, specifically sex tourism, as a tool of accumulating capital. So when you look at Thailand, when they had a big sex tourism boom around the early 1990s, that industry contributed over $27 billion to the country's GDP. The majority of women and children whose bodies were exploited to accumulate that wealth were coerced into doing so by extreme poverty or were trafficked and enslaved. And what happens to that wealth that's generated from their bodies? Well, it's split between hotels, corrupt police agents, tourism agencies, open air bars, saunas, cabarets, and even health clinics. And interestingly, this strategy to legitimize and legalize prostitution is actually backed and propped up and encouraged by both the World Bank and the United Nations, who have been documented as encouraging nations in the global south to establish the sex industry as a legal industry in order to, one, increase their GDP, and two, lower their unemployment numbers. And so I think we see that the sex industry was brought to the global south via colonialism, forced on women via imperialism, and now these women who are nationally oppressed are being used as tools of capital accumulation.
Yeah, I definitely find it kind of wild how the industry, but even just like certain pundits will talk about, black women or other racialized women that are nationally oppressed and kind of discuss them in this very abstract kind of way, you know what I mean? And not necessarily addressing the fact that they represent the most exploited segments of that industry and probably struggle the most to get ahead even within that industry, because it seems as though clearly that, white women and white people generally still dominate even that industry. So I think that says a lot.
Oh yeah. I would absolutely say that's an accurate analysis. And I think something that's so malicious about the strategy of the sex industry today is that they tokenize marginalized women to use them as props to legitimize the industry. So we see this with transgender women, where if you're at all critical of the sex industry, you're told that you're transphobic. And then we also see this with Black women and other women of color. I know that right now in the US, it's somewhat of a popular slogan among progressive circles to say, listen to Black women. And that's important for hopefully obvious reasons. But what ends up happening is that they will pick and choose the Black women or the transgender women that they can use as their tokens and silence other Black or trans or Black and trans women who are critical of the sex industry. So, for example, the case of Vendita Carter, who is a Black woman, also a woman who exited the sex trade and now provides a lot of sort of scholarly and ideological labor into fighting the sex trade. But her work, looking at the connections between the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and prostitution is largely downplayed or ignored.
That's definitely not surprising, but at the same time, it's sinister, I think, when you really think about it.
Oh, it's completely sinister. And I'd like to quote Vendita Carter, actually. She says, "Today, sex-oriented businesses are typically zoned in Black neighborhoods. Poor Black communities have become de facto combat zones, where street prostitution is highly visible and readily available. The implicit message to white men is that it is all right to solicit Black women and girls for sex, that we are all prostitutes. On almost any night, you can see them slowly cruising our neighborhoods, rolling down their windows, calling out to women and girls. The message to Black women is equally clear. This is how it is. This is who we are. This is what we're for." And I think that quote is also echoed in the trans community, in that this is what we're seeing for, this is what we are considered good for. And it's not simply a cultural or an ideological attitude, but it is situated within the very means of subsistence for us, in a sense that if we do not service these men, then our only other option is homelessness, the streets, starvation, or worse.
So that's part one of my interview with Esperanza, and thank you for joining us. For this episode, I kind of split it in half just because it's super long and I want to make sure that all the content gets absorbed. In the past, I definitely had some pretty long episodes, some that were 2 hours long, like the China one. This time I'm going to try to test splitting it in half just to see how it goes. That way I think it'll give people an opportunity to absorb all the information, not having to listen to 2 hours of content. Because even if you pause it, it might be annoying to find where you were at a certain point. But yeah, basically for this episode, we're kind of getting into the crux of analyzing what the material reality is on this question. And then in the next episode, we talk a lot more about solutions and about potential things that can be done. What are some things that happen even through organizing that are patriarchal, so on and so forth. So a lot of interesting things. And again, really want to thank Esperanza for joining me on the show and basically allowing me to interview her, because it's such an intense topic, right? Especially in terms of personal experiences and whatnot. And I definitely feel similarly when it comes to discussing one's identity and so on and so forth in doing this kind of work, because it can be complicated, right? Sometimes I've felt like even weird having to say I'm Black, right? I'll post something on Twitter in regards to Black people or something like that, and then you have people asking me, oh, are you even Black? And then you have to prove it, you know what I mean? And it's annoying, because you hope that the facts alone can stand on their own 2 feet. And I think in the left, people are always trying to make everything a moral question and figuring out what your intentions are, as opposed to focusing on the facts. And it can be annoying. It's understandable a lot of the time, because we have a long history of white chauvinism and racism in organizing historically, right? So it's understandable. And same goes for patriarchy and everything else. And those are all very important things that we do need to address and talk about. But that's something that stuck out to me in this interview, even in regards to myself, that really made me think a lot about, it's annoying. It's definitely annoying. You just want to have your facts and have the information and that be enough. But it's not always enough, right? We do have to consider the reality that people don't trust you if you might not have experienced that thing. And I think, there's a certain basis of correctness to that, but sometimes it does delve into incorrectness. And I think it tends to water down what's actually being said. And then everything becomes about what's the identity of who's saying this versus what is the person saying. And I think that's obviously part of the whole postmodernism and identity politics that is very dominant in modern day politics, at least in the West. It does exist in other parts of the world, but it's very, very prominent here. And I think that says a lot. And aside from that, even, I think the way in which she discussed how it's important to understand the historical basis of a thing, and not only the historical basis, but how it exists in reality, right? What are the concrete realities of it, instead of trying to create an ideal image in our heads of what we might want something to look like in a better way versus what it actually looks like, and then determining what it is and how to deal with it based on how it actually functions on a concrete level globally, right? And I think we tend not to do that, especially the broader left. Obviously, Maoists, communists, we tend to do that. But even Maoists and communists can fail on that, right? So there's a lot of complex things happening in regards to these topics. But anywho, for this episode, it made sense to kind of split it in half. So that's what I decided to do. For part 2, I'll most likely be releasing it, I would guess, a week or 2 after releasing this part 1. I'm assuming it'll be 2 weeks, but it could be shorter than that. I definitely want to make sure that this happens properly, because it's a really important topic and I think a big deal. So with that, this is part 1 of this episode, and next time we will expand and finish the interview. And I would definitely love to hear people's thoughts and moving forward. And I'm hoping I'll have Esperanza on the show even more in the future, depending on what happens, and so I'm definitely looking forward to that. And if you want to support En Masse Podcast, you can go to patreon.com/enmasspodcast. donate as much as you would like. Anything is appreciated, anything helps. To find me, go to enmasspodcast.com. And on the left of the website, you'll see links to all kinds of places you can stream this. There's Apple, Spotify, Google, etc., etc. They're all available there. I make sure to try to share all those links when I promote the episodes as well. So yeah, aside from that, that is all, and looking forward to releasing part 2 and more episodes in the future. And like I said, I'm not going to promise any specific frequency of episodes being released, but episodes will always be released so long as I am breathing and able to do so. And so I will be doing that. And I very much appreciate people's ideas that they've shared with me about potential episodes and things like that. And definitely everything is being considered, and I will do my best to do that in conjunction with all the things going on overall. But thank you very much. And this is En Masse.